Before the great waters swallowed the world, before the sky collapsed and the deep broke open, there were hands, human hands pressing against stone, cupping river water, working clay into vessels that would never be found. Hands that woke each morning to the same biological demands that every human being across every age has faced: the need to wash, to cleanse, to maintain the body that carried them through a world more dangerous, more vast, and more populated with the extraordinary than anything that came after. This is not a story about the clean and the comfortable. This is a story about survival in a world the flood erased, a world where giants walked the earth, where the lifespan of a single human being stretched across centuries, and where the daily act of staying clean was as much a matter of spiritual obligation as physical necessity. A world where hygiene was not a convenience. It was a covenant with existence itself. The civilization that existed before the flood is the most erased chapter in human history, not because its people left nothing behind, but because what they left has been consistently misidentified, minimized, or buried beneath a historical narrative that has no comfortable place for what they represent. These were not primitive ancestors fumbling toward civilization. These were fully formed human societies operating within an environmental framework so different from the present that direct comparison becomes almost meaningless. The atmosphere was different. The hydrological cycle was different. The biological parameters of human life were different. And within all of that difference, people still woke up, still moved their bodies through the world, and still faced the ancient, unglamorous reality of keeping themselves clean. To understand hygiene in the time of the Nephilim, the first thing that must be understood is water. Not water as the modern world experiences it, delivered through pipes, pressurized, chemically treated, arriving on demand. Water as a living presence. Water as a feature of the landscape that shaped every decision, every settlement, every daily routine. The antediluvian world existed beneath what many researchers and theologians describe as a vapor canopy, a layer of moisture suspended in the upper atmosphere that maintained consistent warmth across the Earth's surface, filtered ultraviolet radiation, and created conditions of extraordinary biological abundance. The Earth was watered differently, from below, through mist, through springs, through the upwelling of underground reservoirs that fed rivers and pools, with a constancy that made water omnipresent in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct. This abundance of accessible, natural water was the foundation of antediluvian hygiene. Rivers were not obstacles or boundaries. They were the arteries of daily life, the place where bodies were cleaned, where wounds were tended, where the accumulated contact with soil and labor and fire was rinsed away. The act of immersion in moving water was understood across virtually every ancient culture as both physically cleansing and spiritually restorative. This was not symbolic language invented after the fact. It was the encoding of something that pre-flood people practiced with the same regularity that modern individuals apply to a morning shower, except the medium was a living river, and the understanding of what water did to the body was both more intimate and more reverential than anything the modern world brings to the act of bathing. Soap, as the modern world formulates it, did not exist in the antediluvian period, but the assumption that its absence meant the absence of cleansing agents profoundly misunderstands what the natural world provides when human beings live in direct contact with it across centuries of observation. Plant saponins, naturally occurring compounds found in dozens of plant species that produce a lathering action when agitated with water, were known and used. Soapwort produces a gentle but effective cleansing foam. A yucca root generates a rich lather that cleanses both skin and hair. Ash, produced in abundance by any fire-keeping community, when combined with water creates an alkaline solution that cuts through grease and organic material with a chemistry as sound as any modern product. These were not accidental discoveries. In a world where individual human beings lived for centuries, the accumulation of botanical knowledge within a single lifetime reached depths that modern pharmaceutical researchers approach only through systematic institutional effort. A healer who had spent 400 years observing plant properties possessed a pharmacological understanding of staggering depth. The cleansing plants were known. Their preparations were refined. Their applications were specific. different preparations for different parts of the body, different seasons, different purposes. This was applied science, conducted over timescales that dwarf the entire history of the modern scientific enterprise. The Nephilim, those enormous semi-divine beings whose existence is recorded in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Book of Enoch, and in the mythological frameworks of cultures across every inhabited continent, occupied a biological reality that made hygiene both more challenging and more urgent than it was for ordinary human beings. The scale of these entities meant that the basic biological processes of the body produced waste, sweat, and physical presence at a magnitude proportionally greater than human norms. Water immersion for beings of Nephilim scale required rivers of substantial depth and volume. Where the great rivers of the antediluvian world, many of which no longer exist in their original form, their courses disrupted or entirely redirected by the geological violence of the flood, would have served this function. For ordinary human beings living within or adjacent to Nephilim communities, hygiene carried an additional dimension of survival strategy. Smell communicated information that modern sanitized environments have rendered largely irrelevant: health, illness, fear, territorial identity. In a world where giant beings move through human settlements with the casual authority of the powerful among the powerless, the ability to manage one's own scent profile was a form of self-protection. Aromatic plants serve this function with sophistication that modern perfumery only partially replicates. Cedar oil was applied to skin and hair as both a cleanser and a scent modifier. Myrrh and frankincense resins, whose modern associations are almost entirely ceremonial, were in daily practical use as antibacterial agents and body deodorants. The chemistry behind these applications is well understood. The antimicrobial compounds in these resins are both real and effective. The ceremony came after. The practical application came first. Hair presented its own hygiene challenge. The ancient accounts consistently depict long, elaborate hair as a marker of identity, power, and spiritual status. Washing it without modern chemical surfactants required both knowledge and patience. Fermented rinses, produced from plant matter allowed to break down in water, created acidic solutions that removed buildup and restored natural oils. Clay, a particularly the fine particle mineral-rich clay found near river systems, was worked through hair and scalp as a cleansing agent, drawing out oils and debris before being rinsed away in flowing water. The result was not chemically standardized cleanliness, but it was effective, sustainable, and produced by materials that any person with centuries of botanical knowledge and access to a living river could reliably obtain. Oral hygiene was addressed through means that modern dentistry has largely validated. Chewing sticks cut from specific plant species whose antimicrobial properties are now confirmed by laboratory analysis were the primary implement of dental care. The miswak stick, used across Middle Eastern and African cultures in an unbroken tradition that likely extends to pre-flood practice. Eye releases compounds that inhibit the bacterial growth responsible for decay and gum disease. Studies have repeatedly found its cleaning efficacy comparable to modern toothbrushes when used correctly. In a world where individuals expected to live 7 or 8 centuries, the preservation of dental health was not cosmetic, it was survival. Systemic infection originating in dental decay, untreated, is fatal. A being living through their 4th century of life who had not developed effective oral hygiene practices would not have reached their 4th century. Skin care in the time of the Nephilim was inseparable from medicine. The boundary between cosmetic and therapeutic application that modern culture maintains so clearly did not exist. Because the practitioners who prepared skin treatments understood the skin as what it actually is. The largest organ of the body, a permeable membrane through which both protective and harmful substances pass. Oils pressed from seeds and nuts were applied not merely to soften skin, but to maintain its barrier function and deliver fat-soluble compounds whose therapeutic properties were mapped through centuries of observation. Clay was used as both cleanser and treatment. Sulfur-containing spring waters were visited regularly by communities who understood that specific water sources produced specific benefits. Knowledge mapped through long, patient observation of cause and effect across lifespans that gave the observers time enough to be certain of what they saw. While sanitation, The management of human waste is the aspect of antediluvian hygiene that modern imagination most reflexively associates with primitive discomfort. The absence of toilet paper is treated as evidence of fundamental inadequacy, as though the pre-modern world simply endured what it could not address. This picture collapses on contact with evidence. Water was the primary sanitation medium, the left hand, designated across ancient Middle Eastern cultures, with a specificity of purpose that survives as social taboo into the present day, was used for post-elimination cleaning with water drawn from carried vessels or nearby sources. The cultural prohibition against eating with the left hand, preserved across Arabic, Hebrew, and broader Semitic traditions, is the direct social encoding of a sanitation practice so fundamental it became embedded in social law. It was not incidental. It was systematic, widely understood, and effective at preventing the fecal-oral transmission of pathogens that represents one of the primary disease vectors in environments without modern plumbing. Smooth stones, leaves of specific plant species selected for both texture and antimicrobial properties, and moss, whose absorbent and naturally antibacterial qualities modern outdoor survival guides still recommend, completed the material toolkit of personal sanitation. The selection was not random. The leaves of certain species contain compounds that actively inhibit bacterial growth. The choice of these species across multiple cultures and continents reflects knowledge either developed through long observation or inherited from a common source old enough to predate the geographical separation of those cultures. The flood, and what existed before it, is the only proposed common source the timeline supports. Community sanitation in antediluvian settlements was organized around the principles of water flow and distance from habitation that subsequent civilizations encoded into law. Waste pits, positioned downhill and downwind from living areas, directed organic material away from water sources. The microbial decomposition of organic waste is not a modern discovery. It is a natural process that any long-observing community would have mapped with precision. The Nephilim complicated this picture in ways the physical logic of the situation makes unavoidable. Beings of extraordinary scale produced waste of extraordinary volume. Communities that housed or served Nephilim faced sanitation challenges requiring organized, collective solutions. The ancient accounts of human communities living in proximity to these giants describe conditions of servitude extending to every aspect of daily life. And the management of physical reality, unglamorous as it is in a narrative about divine beings and cosmic catastrophe, was part of that burden. What emerges from serious engagement with the hygiene practices of the antediluvian world is not primitive inadequacy, but sophisticated adaptation. A society that had developed through centuries of accumulated individual knowledge and millennia of collective refinement, a complete system of bodily care using what the natural world provided. No factories, no supply chains, no chemical synthesis, but rivers of living water, forests of medicinal plants, mineral-rich clay, purifying resins, and human beings who had spent enough time alive to understand all of it with a depth that modern specialists spend careers trying to approximate. The flood ended that world. The waters did not discriminate between the corrupt and the practical, between the moral catastrophe of the Nephilim and the quiet daily knowledge of the woman who knew which leaves to use, how to prepare the clay, where the cleansing spring ran coldest in the dry season. All of it went under. The plants, the rivers, the accumulated botanical knowledge encoded in centuries of lived experience. The spring systems, the old-growth forests whose resins had served generations beyond counting. What survived did so in the minds and hands of 8 people. Fragments of memory carried forward into a world remade by catastrophe. A world with different weather, different soils, different rivers running different courses through landscapes rearranged by geological violence. They rebuilt. They remembered what they could. And somewhere in the distance between what they remembered and what we have inherited lies the true measure of what was lost. The next time a hand reaches for what it needs without thinking, for the tap, the soap, the paper, the invisible infrastructure of a sanitized world, it is worth pausing to consider the hand that reached before it, the hand that cupped the river, that worked the clay, That stripped the bark from the cleansing branch with the calm efficiency of someone who had done it for 200 years and expected to do it for 200 more. That hand knew things, and the water it held has long since returned to the sea,